The Roman Empire has fallen.
No!
Hopefully most people watching this already knew that, but actually, when did it fall? The only correct answer is the empire never fell because it lives on in our hearts. I've got 4 dates for when the empire fell. Number 1, 476 AD, the traditional end of the Western Empire. The Roman system had been spiraling out of control for a while. Worst of all, the barbarians were migrating across the borders. Military spending was up and effectiveness was down. The armies were spread thin. Entire provinces were being abandoned, like Britannia in 410 AD, the first ever Brexit. The Roman state was crumbling under enormous pressure from all angles, unable or unwilling to shoulder the cost of administration. Imperial territory had been reduced to Italy and parts of the Balkans. All the former provinces were taken over by barbarian warlords who, to varying degrees, maintained Roman administration structures. Emperors were installed and cast aside on a whim. Roman order was breaking down. In 410, for example, Rome was sacked, and again in 455 AD, the city was plundered for the first time since 510 BC. The last emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, having deposed his predecessor, was himself deposed by a barbarian in 476 AD. This marked the end of the empire, the final nail in the coffin. There are several problems with that. Number 1, the eastern half of the empire carried on for a long time. They were still Romans, and damn fine ones at that. Number 2, the barbarians had taken over imperial territory before, often installing puppet emperors to do their bidding. Odoacer, the guy who deposed Romulus, legitimized his rule by submitting to the emperor in the east. Number 3, the emperor that Romulus deposed, Julius Nepos, continued to rule a small state in modern Croatia. Odoacer even hailed him as emperor. Number 4, no one in Italy and Rome really even considered the empire had fallen. For them, life went on as normal. The Senate still functioned, the aqueducts still supplied water, Roman soldiers still went out and conquered territory. Nothing much had changed. And number 5, it seems that the fall of Rome in 476 narrative was started by this Eastern Roman writer, Marcellinus, in around the 510s AD. At the time, there were questions in Constantinople about whether or not they should reconquer Rome and Italy. The next date that comes up is in the 540s AD. The Wars of Justinian, who was emperor in the east, sent his top general Belisarius to lead the campaign. Along the way, Belisarius captured large parts of North Africa before heading on towards Rome. The campaign went amazingly well. Most people in Italy were actually quite sympathetic to the East Roman cause. Naples, Rome, Milan were all captured with minimal bloodshed. The barbarians, however, struck back, first by razing Milan and slaughtering the population. Rome was eventually retaken by the barbarians, who pillaged the city and destroyed much of the infrastructure like the defensive walls. They then left the city to its own devices, which allowed Belisarius to occupy it again. And he more or less pillaged the city, first to rebuild the walls and things like that, but also to pay his soldiers and provide equipment. The barbarians, once again, laid siege, breaking through and absolutely devastating the city. And then 3 years later, the Roman forces finally and permanently captured the city again. The war not only ruined the city of Rome, but destroyed most of Italy. For example, the population of Rome in 300 AD was roughly 1 million. In 450 AD, it was about 500,000. And then after Justinian's conquest, it was as low as 35,000 people. In the fighting, the aqueducts had been destroyed. People of Rome were left living in tiny pockets of the city amongst the ruined buildings, which had been overgrown with grass and bushes, and population throughout Italy retreated from urban centres to find safety in seclusion, like up in the hills or away from the roads. In addition, the Justinian plague, an early version of the Black Death, had been sweeping through the Mediterranean, killing an estimated 30 to 40% of Europe's population. So it looks like in trying to re-establish imperial control, Justinian may have dealt a fatal blow to the Western Empire. The entire imperial structure had collapsed. Population collapsed, the economy was ruined, and society had crumbled. The empire in the east, however, continued. 1204 AD, the sack of Constantinople. The imperial territory had been shrinking ever since the days of Justinian. First the Muslim conquest, then the Slavs came in, then the Seljuks. Finally, the Latin cities like Venice and Genoa had been exerting greater influence, particularly in things like trade and commerce. Tensions had been rising between the empire and the Latin cities for a while. Both of them had been exchanging massacres for decades, which culminated in the Fourth Crusade. Now, the original purpose of the crusade was to retake Jerusalem, which a few years before had been lost to the Muslims. The Crusaders had contacted the Venetians to build them a fleet so they could sail from Europe to the Middle East. However, a much smaller Crusader army than expected showed up in Venice. They couldn't pay the bill. So the Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, devised a smart plan. The Crusaders would help the Venetians capture Zara, a city on the Atlantic coast, and in return, their debt would be cleared. Pretty simple. So the Crusaders agreed, of course, and they captured Zara with minimal effort. As they continued toward Jerusalem, the Crusaders were contacted by Alexios Angelos, an East Roman prince trying to restore his deposed father to the throne. Crusaders helped out of the kindness of their hearts, and so they diverted their effort toward Constantinople. They won. Alexios was crowned co-emperor, only to be deposed a few months later before he could pay the Crusaders. So the Crusader Brains Trust, along with the Venetians, they couldn't leave empty-handed, of course, so they decided to conquer the city outright. After a short, brutal battle, they sacked the city, slaughtering many of the inhabitants, and they looted anything they could carry and destroyed the rest. This is where the famous horses of St. Mark in Venice come from, the Hippodrome in Constantinople. The destruction of the city dealt an irreparable blow to the empire's power in the region. The policy of the Latins was called Partitio Terrarium Imperii Romana, a partition of the Roman Empire. Many Roman refugees went on to found smaller successor states. 57 years later, the Empire of Nicaea, under the Palaiologos, established Greek rule over Constantinople. 1453, the fall of Constantinople. So by this point, the empire was like a badly wounded animal. Since the recapture of Constantinople from the Crusade, it had experienced decline in almost every area of society. The population of the capital was reduced to around 50,000, described as a series of small villages connected by open fields. And the empire's territory was pretty much Constantinople and the surrounds. Nevertheless, the young Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, desired the city above all else. So he pitched up with a massive cannon and 80,000 of his friends to capture Constantinople, which he did. The last emperor, Constantine Palaiologos, fought until the bitter end, and supposedly, before his final charge, his last words were, "The city has fallen and I'm still alive." Many believed that he was saved from death by an angel who turned him into a marble statue and hid him in a secret cave under the Golden Gate, where Constantine waited for the angel's call to awaken and retake the city. The Ottomans actually walled up the Golden Gate as a precaution against Constantine's resurrection. So that's it. Most historians view Constantinople's fall as the final end of the Roman Empire. A millennium and a half after Augustus established the empire, and 1100 years after Constantine founded Constantinople, the Roman Empire breathed its last breath. Although the Ottomans did claim to be legitimate inheritors of Rome, and the title of emperor was sort of passed around Europe for a few centuries, I think whichever date you choose, there never was an end, at least not in the same way that something like a book ends. I prefer to think of it as a continuum, with a few punctuation points along the way. So on one side you've got the Roman Empire, and then on the other side, post-Roman. Similar to, a black and white continuum. When does the black become white? So when did the Roman Empire end? I don't know. sometime after the 3rd century and sometime before the 16th. I should say I like the 1453 date. The fall of Constantinople into Muslim hands seems as good a point as any. And there's something awesome, something that piques my curiosity about a Roman Empire that began life in the time of Augustus and continued existing throughout most of the Middle Ages. And remember, even if it's not true, you have to believe in history.